What I'm going to present, I titled Scientific Model for Remote Viewing, but it's actually kind of a model of from mysticism for remote viewing and a model from science for remote viewing, because I'm planning to bring the two together. Acupuncture, acupressure, healing through prayer, plus things like morphogenesis, miracles, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and reincarnation. And what I discovered is all these different people are exploring these phenomena, are coming up with different ways of trying to explain them, kind of most of them not too good. In fact, none of them very satisfying. And they're using things like biofields, and they're talking about consciousness, and of course, you know, everything's consciousness, so that really doesn't help you a lot when you say, well, it's consciousness. But so what I discovered is actually mysticism has an explanation for really all of this phenomena, a physical explanation. They have a physical basis for this world. And what I discovered is that, and what I couldn't quite understand is why wasn't anyone using the physical basis offered by mysticism? And in addition to that, I've discovered that I think science has already discovered what the mystics were talking about. They just don't know it yet. They haven't quite brought it home. So I hope to show that to you today. And again, you can't read this, but let me just say, mysticism, we have a kind of a misperception of what mysticism is. It's actually a very pragmatic, highly disciplined area, as much as our Western sciences, if not more so. But it's concerned specifically with knowledge and techniques involved in the direct experience of the spiritual states or ultimate reality. And it does provide a physical basis. Basically, what mysticism has said throughout the ages is, and well, there are actually multiple planes of matter that exist, and this is just one plane of matter, the stuff we normally deal with and can see, but there are many other planes of matter that we can't see. And according to this knowledge, man is composed of several interpenetrating sheaths or subtle bodies called kosas, which are made up of matter from different planes, each of different relative density. Now, a lot of cultures actually, I'd say most third world cultures, really kind of, this is just part of their worldview. It's not, they don't really divide things up into mysticism, not mysticism. So this is just a general part of their world view, and this is knowledge that's kind of known throughout the world. And the belief of non-visible bodies composed of matter from other planes has been described in considerable detail in the mystical or shamanistic traditions of ancient and present day cultures throughout the world. Most, if not all, of spiritual and philosophical writings and teachings that have emerged contain this concept. That includes the ancient Egyptians, Chinese and Greeks, the North American Indians, the tribes of Africa, Incas, the Christians, the Vedic seers of India, to name a few, diverse cultures. All find the study of visible and invisible bodies as a key to the nature of man and the universe. And over on the right here, we have a picture of subtle bodies showing the chakras. Again, this might be showing the energies involved in subtle bodies. These are pictures from Alex Gray. Leadbeater says that the soul has not one body but many bodies, for when he is sufficiently evolved, he is able to express himself on all these different levels of nature, and he is therefore provided with a suitable vehicle of matter belonging to each. And it is through these various vehicles that he is able to conceive impressions from the world to which they correspond. Anyway, you can barely see here. These are the subtle bodies as we see them in India. There's the Annamaya Kosa, which is actually the visible body. And then there's the Pranamaya Kosa, which when you hear about prana and pranic stuff, that's what the prana, that actually connects with the body of the pranic subtle body, which is equivalent to the etheric subtle body, and it's probably the etheric and astral body in our system. And So basically, India has the anomycosa, the pranomycosa, the monomycosa, the vaginomycosa, and the non-mycosa. And that takes you up through like cognitive mind to discriminating intelligence and the soul, and also eventually the spirit, or just bliss consciousness. But the next thing, we're back to slide one. But the next thing we really want to take a look at is the next question asks, if we assume these subtle bodies are real, in terms of Western science, this is possible. Is it possible to have interpenetrating bodies or interpenetrating matter that's not readily visible? And the answer is going to be yes. And we're going to take a look at two, really just a brief review of physics, two properties. One is of mass. Mass really has three properties. First of all, it has the inertial property, which comes from the equation F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. That's really a defining equation for force. But it also is the first property of mass. It tells you that mass is what resists the movement of a force. That's the first property. It's called the inertial property. That was put out by Newton. The second property is gravity, which was also put out by Newton. Mass interacts with mass by attracting. That's what holds us to this earth. Hey. Let's see where I am on this. I hope everyone's, let's see, we got through mysticism. And I guess I'm going to have to get pretty close to this. Oh, there it is. Okay, we talked about, these are the basic properties of subtle bodies. You have the sheaths, you have the chakras or energy centers, which you're probably all familiar with. You have the nadis, which are the things like meridians, but there are a bunch of nerve systems set up that connect the chakras with with each other in the subtle bodies. Again, Western mysticism, basically 5 or 7 subtle bodies. Again, it varies. Different people have different systems. Only one of them is normally visible to our regular perception. 5 subtle bodies in India. And then when you're dealing with ancient Egypt, who were probably the experts on subtle body phenomena and subtle matter in general, you actually have 10. And I really hate to run through this, but we have to. When you're dealing with the chakras, generally they talk about 7 chakras, again, though they may combine a few of them. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on that at this point. And the nadis are the meridians, there's 8 extraordinary vessels. You know, in China, they mostly work with the nadis. In India, with the chakras. Different cultures have picked out different aspects of this to really look into and to specialize in, you can say. So this is a question. According to modern physics, is it possible for matter to be invisible and interpenetrate with our visible matter as the subtle bodies would generally be? And what I'd like to say is 100 years ago, actually, it wouldn't have been, because atoms were regarded as the smallest indivisible particle you could have. So they were regarded as completely solid, and so nothing could really penetrate them. Actually, 100 years ago, they didn't like to talk about atoms because physicists didn't like to talk about things they couldn't see back then. Of course, today, they never talk about anything you can see. But back then, they didn't like to talk about things you couldn't see, so they wouldn't talk about atoms, they'd say elements. They wouldn't talk about molecules, they would use the term crystals. 100 years ago, actually, the universe was a lot smaller. It was all contained in the Milky Way. We didn't know that there were 50 billion other such Milky Ways in existence. The Big Bang didn't exist. The universe was regarded as steady state, and that was really a hard doctrine to really change. The universe looked quite different, but if we take a look again at the properties of mass, we have the inertial property again, F equals ma. Mass is what resists movement. We have the gravitational property that masses exert a force upon each other. And then actually this century, Einstein discovered that actually mass is a form of energy. And in fact, c squared, c is the speed of light. That's a very, very large number, so it takes an awful lot of energy to produce really a small piece of mass. The other thing we want to look at is charge. And this turns out to be, again, charge started with just this electrostatic phenomena. When you rub two objects together, you kind of get a little clinging effect. Didn't seem to be very important. But people always felt that charge, electricity somehow was involved with magnetism, but they never made a connection until about 1821, which is really an event that didn't get much publicity. But Oersted discovered in 1821, quite accidentally, that he had a compass near a current-carrying wire, and the compass moved. And this was done accidentally, and this was the first hint that electricity and magnetism were connected. And then, about 50 years later, after they had developed the basic electromagnetic equations, a guy by the name of Maxwell, who was the first to realize there was something wrong with these equations, one of them was inconsistent with the other three, he made that correction, and then he was able to easily develop a wave equation, which they knew about quite well back then. And he could tell you the speed of that electromagnetic wave. In other words, electromagnetism should have a wave associated with it, and its speed could be calculated from electric and magnetic constants, and it turned out to be so close to the speed of light that he presumed that light was in fact an electromagnetic phenomenon. And this turned out to be quite true. In fact, visible light is only a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which goes from electric waves to microwaves, infrared, and then into the visible spectrum, then ultraviolet, and then you have X-rays and gamma rays. All of that turns out to be just part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and the visible aspect is very small. No one had dreamed that light was just a small part of something much bigger. So as it turns out, you know, the reason we see objects is not because of mass, but because of charge. Charge has that property. Then this century, we get into quantum mechanics, which is even more interesting because it shows us that all the chemical properties of atoms is due to charge. So really, charge turns out to be everything. In fact, the reason you can, the reason you can hold an object in your hand that doesn't fall through your hand is because of the electric forces of the atoms. They keep objects from interpenetrating each other. So what you discover really is the reason we could see objects is because of charge. The reason we can feel objects is because of charge too. Chemistry is due to charge. So from the point of view of the electric field, we could say that the atom appears quite solid. But actually, if you look at the mass, it's a different picture. The mass is almost totally concentrated in a very tiny nucleus. Size of the nucleus is around 100,000th the size of the atom itself. So most of the mass sits right in a very tiny nucleus. Give you an idea of how small that would be if you had a grain of salt and a football stadium. The grain of salt would be the nucleus, the football stadium would be the rest of the atom. So atoms, from the point of view of mass, are made up of essentially just a very small part of it physically. But from the point of view of the electric field, they would appear very solid. So what we could say is if there was a massive object, let's see what I have next. Oh, that's showing the chakras. You know, this kind of shows, going back to the chakras briefly, this kind of shows a picture of the how the chakras might look visually on the right. If you were to look here, these are actually symbolic images of the chakras. Oops. On the left side of this picture, though, you kind of see an interrelationship between chakras and organs. So these chakras really connect quite well to the visible body. But okay, so we'll move on. So getting back to matter, if there was a massive object not composed of electrically charged particles, we could not see it, and it could pass right through visible matter. There would be no force with which they interact. So in fact, it turns out, and when we talk about subtle bodies and subtle matter, the property that would enable an object to interpenetrate with visible matter and to make it invisible is the same property, charge. So if you had particles that were not made of charged particles, as kind of shown in the picture on the right there, which I took out of the Smithsonian, would show you how mass could really just pass right through visible matter if it was not composed of charged particles. So supposing that we had visible matter, or supposing we had a form of matter that was made up, that was held together by a different type of force than charge, what would happen is the two objects would just pass right through each other because there'd be no force with which they interact. So, you know, the question, is it possible for matter to interpenetrate with our bodies and to still be invisible? Yes. All you need is that it's not composed of charged particles. It's held together by a different force. I also want to point out, in the world of physics today, there are actually only 4 known fundamental forces. Everything is explainable for the dense matter that they operate with in terms of these 4 forces. Gravity and the electric charge, we already talked about, electromagnetic phenomena. And then you have 2 nuclear forces. The nuclear forces are important because they do hold the nucleus together. They do help generate sun power, solar power. The force of the sun is operated by it. But these are extremely short-range forces. So in essence, everything you see happening on this planet would be regarded as happening from electromagnetically, supposedly. So we'll come back to that idea later. Next question, is there any indication of such matter existing in the universe? Matter which we can't readily see, and a fair amount of it too. I mean, we don't want little minuscule amounts of matter, you know, that we can't see. I mean, it should be a reasonable amount if we're going to have multiple subtle bodies and all kinds of other things going on. And lo and behold, about 25 years ago, this phenomenon of dark matter started entering physics. Actually, it was originally noticed in the 1930s, but no one paid much attention to it because they didn't know what to make of it. But it became quite clear that there was an awful lot of mass out there. Let's see what we have next. There's an awful lot of mass out there, in fact, that we can't see. In fact, most of the universe is made up of this mass. They know it's there because of its gravitational effects. It cannot be seen directly, but it's detectable through its gravitational effects on stellar, galactic, and galaxy cluster, supercluster observations. It's responsible for at least 90% of the mass in the universe, and probably today they're thinking more like 95%. It has strangely enough, a spherical distribution in the galaxies. You notice the galaxy on the right, the luminous matter, and like most galaxies, lies on a flat plane. But if you look above that plane and below it, you don't see anything, but the dark matter is actually encircling it in a spherical manner. It's not lying on the flat plane. That tells you right off the bat it doesn't behave like regular luminous matter. It's behaving very differently. In fact, they can't really come up with a model that will explain why it's behaving that way unless that matter is interacting with itself. And the fourth point here is very recent. They've only discovered very recently that the distance the dark matter moves out is 10 times further than the luminous stars. This creates a bit of a problem because if you go out 10 times from our galaxy and then 10 times out from our nearest galaxy, the Andromeda galaxy, you find that you have overlapping dark matter. So actually we're kind of sharing dark matter with our nearest neighbor. This kind of puts a limit on how far they can detect it too, because they're not too sure how far out, much further out it goes, but they know it goes out at least 10 times. And roughly this tells you that it contains at least 1,000 times the mass of luminous stars. So, I mean, in a galaxy, by far much of the matter there is what they call dark matter, which they don't know what it is at this time. But it has some nice properties that I find of interest. One is that it's not readily visible, which I kind of like. It could be subtle matter. And the second point is there's an awful lot of it. And also it's obviously not behaving like luminous matter, or it'd be lying down in the flat plane like everything else. Scientists kind of come up with 2 possibilities for dark matter, for candidates. This is what they're looking at. They're looking at remnants of burnt out stars and also what they call massive compact halo objects, machos, which are like brown dwarfs. Well, there aren't enough black holes to account for this. They do see white dwarfs, but they can tell that there's nowhere near the number of white dwarfs. White dwarfs are kind of burnt out stars that still glow a little, so you can still detect them. The brown dwarfs are actually large objects that don't quite have enough mass to become stars. They maybe have, like a tenth the mass of our sun or less, so they never quite become stars. And recently they've been able to detect quite a few of these, but again, nowhere near the numbers. So they know really nothing fits in this category. In the center, you have things like neutrinos, very light axions, and weak interacting massive particles, WIMPs. The other category is the subatomic particle group, which, again, it's interesting. This mass is, by the way, dark matter is also like stable. So when you look in the second category of subatomic particles, not to get too technical, but there are only a few stable subatomic particles. There's the proton, which has charge. There's the electron, which has charge, so it'll be visible also. The photon, which is light. And then you have neutrinos, which are not readily visible. And neutrinos have an interesting history. I don't want to go into all its history, but very recently, again, they've been able to determine that neutrinos have mass, which they couldn't determine before, but a very, very small amount of mass. Furthermore, they used to think there were 3 types of neutrinos, but it turns out there are 3 energy states for one type of neutrino. Neutrinos are very subtle particles, it's hard to say whether or not they would be involved in this unless they could really interact with each other, I would say. The neutralino, which is the WIMP, is kind of a big nuclear type particle, and they've been looking to detect that as predicted by some of the theories that they have in physics, and they haven't been able to detect any. So I think actually my recommendation, with all this matter out there, my recommendation is the best: subtle matter. Uncharged particles which can interact with each other and compose the subtle bodies of life. They existed before the Big Bang, the event which created dense matter out of subtle matter. And I kind of want to explain before the Big Bang. Let me talk to you a little bit about the Big Bang and why I think this all came before the Big Bang. If you look at the Big Bang, there are 3 things that tell you about the Big Bang. One is the Doppler shift, which in 1929 is what Hubble discovered looking at a few distant galaxies. He was able to show that the universe was expanding. It took quite a while before this took root. Then in the 60s, a couple guys who, let's see, what were their names? Well, a couple guys noticed that there was this background radiation that they couldn't quite get rid of, low-level radiation. And some other people had already predicted that it might exist, and somehow they got together. And so they were able to show there's a background radiation or echo of the Big Bang. And then the primordial nucleosynthesis, which is the nuclear production at the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang. These are actually the 3 ideas that create the Big Bang hypotheses, but these are all based on electromagnetic radiation. So you can't really say that dark matter was created at the Big Bang. It could have existed before the Big Bang, and you wouldn't know it. And the reason I think so is because if you look again at subtle body theory and the creation of the universe, what it appears, well, look at if you take a scientific look at the Big Bang, I mean, here's how scientists view the Big Bang today. There was this big explosion which probably came out of singularity, which they don't know why it happened at all. And then within seconds, minutes, all the forces of physics were created, and the universe from that point on went on like a dead machine, and it might as well not have had any consciousness as far as anyone knows. Events just happen. They don't know why these physical properties occurred at all. Let's see. Here's a well-known physicist, astronomer. He's the Royal Astronomer in Britain. He says, we realize that for us to exist, the universe must have had very special properties. It is expanding at the right rate and is governed by the right laws of physics and allow stars to be big and stable enough to shine, planets to exist, and complex chemistry to be formed. This seems to invoice a lot of apparent coincidences. One way of accounting for that is to say the universe was set up that way by providence. But the alternative explanation is to say that there are, listen to this, countless other universes displaying all kinds of behavior, and among them, huge ensemble. There are bound to be some that have these special conditions. He's kind of suggesting that there's an infinite number of unconscious universes out there. I mean, it's just absurd to think that a universe without consciousness could exist. I don't know why he thinks probability existed before the Big Bang, and that kind of strikes me as strange too. But I think what happens, though, if you add subtle matter into this picture, then you may discover that the universe is not just a dead machine, but it's a living, breathing, learning organism that's actually user-friendly. The Big Bang, to me, appears to be the last event in a series of cascading events which led to the production of this dense matter. So this is from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, The Fall. Bababadaragtag kam en narang kon bran ton around thon thun trovar horn nan scan tuhu hur denanthernuk of a once wall straight old power is retailed early in bed and later on life down through all Christian minstrelsy. And that 30-syllable word he has there actually comes from syllables from the word for thunder from different cultures. So he's basically using a very interesting symbol here in Finnegan's Wake to describe the fall of man, basically the same one I am, the Big Bang. So when scientists are studying the Big Bang, in my mind, they're actually, it appears now they're really studying original sin, but they don't quite know it. This is the fall of man. This is the production of dense matter. This is the production from spirit to dense matter and through all the subtle matter that went through it. So that's a different perspective. Like I said, I really feel scientists have already discovered what the mystics were talking about. They just don't know it yet. They're looking at something different. And the other thing is, we might consider the possibility that the periodic table really has a three-dimensional quality to it. On the bottom, you have the charged matter, the antimatter, using the Hindu perspective. And then you have pranic matter. Charged matter would interact strongly with charged matter, and pranic matter would interact strongly with pranic matter. Monomatter would interact strongly with monomatter. Vijnana matter would interact strongly with vijnana matter, and so on. I think the pyramid shows it best. But you also have to have interactions that go this way as well. There would have to be a weak interaction with charged matter or pranic matter, or we couldn't get the information from the pranic body. So, you know, when you're dealing like with remote viewing, I mean, remote viewing probably comes right into the pranic body in most cases, but you have to have the ability to, you know, to pick it up. We know the physiology of the body knows what's going on, but how do you get it? In other words, the pranic matter probably knows what's going on, but how do you get it then to the dense matter? How do you understand what the subtle bodies are really telling you? This was an interesting aside I noticed too. You might think that because of this the soul had some weight. Human soul weighs 1/3000th of an ounce. According to researchers at the Technical University of Berlin, they weighed over 200 terminally ill patients just before and immediately after death. In each case, the weight loss was the same, 1/3000th of an ounce. In a letter in German science journal Horizon, Dr. Becker Mertens said his team had taken into account other possible explanations of weight loss, such as air leaving lungs, but that the inescapable conclusion is that we have now confirmed the existence of the human soul. The challenge was to figure out exactly what the soul is composed of. Actually, you know, people have been trying to do this type of thing over the past 100 years, and this one kind of struck me because it was rather detailed, you might say. But I should also mention Rudolf Steiner explains that when the body dies, the etheric body doesn't leave the visible body. It's actually connected to it pretty strongly. And the astral body has to hang around to just supply energy So when you die, what leaves the body is the causal body and the soul. So this is kind of close to that type of figure. So this wouldn't be the weight of the etheric body, which presumably would be considerably heavier, though I don't know how you weigh that. But actually, I think we can do much better than this today if we really wanted to. It's a question of, what do we really need to prove to the scientific community that we are composed of this subtle matter, of dark matter, as far as I can see. And the answer is you got to really wait for the next generation, because there's going to be a lot of people who really want to be able to show scientifically that man has a soul. Now, I want to come back to earlier slide, if I can. But the evidence I feel already exists for these subtle bodies is really from the first slide, remote viewing. I think you're all familiar with that. Subtle energies. This is from Larry Dawsey. There exist many published reports of experiments in which persons were able to influence a variety of cellular and other biological systems at a distance. These studies evaluate the ability of humans to affect physiological functions of a variety of living systems, including studies where the receiver or target is unaware that such an effort is being made. The target systems included bacteria, yeast, fungi, algae, plants, protozoa, larvae, insects, chicks, mice, rats, gerbils, cats, and dogs, as well as cellular preparations, blood cells, neurons, cancer cells, and enzyme activities. In human target persons, eye movement, muscular movement, electrodermal activity, respiration, and brain rhythms have been affected through the influence at a distance. There is a whole society of subtle body, subtle energy and subtle energy medicine now that exists, international society, that continues to explore this. Typically, though, and you'll see in all this phenomena, typically you can't screen this off. In other words, if this were electromagnetic phenomena, which some people would like to believe it is, you could easily screen it off, prevent the electromagnetic waves from moving. Whatever this phenomena is, it can pass right through visible matter. So basically, you're dealing with subtle matter again. You're dealing with dark subtle matter. And I want to remind, dark matter is really a bad name for this stuff. I mean, actually, these bodies are self-luminous bodies. And furthermore, people who get into these experiences, time and space of this physical world is very different from time and space in this world. You might remind yourself of dreams you've had. I mean, the space and time in a dream is quite different. People cannot talk about their experiences when they're in these different subtle body experiences, because the time and space is so different. There's just no language adequate, and our language is particularly bad. I mean, we don't even have a word for subtle energy. I mean, everybody has a word for subtle energy. That was a nice image of the human soul weighing 1/3000 an ounce. But let me give you an example of cultures that actually have names for subtle energy. Almost every culture. You would be hard-pressed, this is the short list, you would be hard-pressed to find a culture in this world, a third world culture particularly, that doesn't have a word for chi or prana or ki or mana. I mean, there's a whole list of names for these titles, and I can assure you, if they know about subtle energy, they know about subtle bodies as well. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, they won't talk with us about it. I have been told that, in fact, I gave this lecture once to it was supposed to be third world in science, and they didn't think third world had science, so I did a lecture similar to this one. But there was an African girl there, and afterwards she came up to me and she said, well, I don't understand your science very much, but, we know all about this stuff, but I've been told not to talk about it. So that's a typical response you get from third world. You can talk to people from India about this, but they won't talk to you about it unless you bring it up. Okay, other things, paranormal senses. I don't want to go into details of this, but I think it's obvious they exist. Alternative healing therapies, there are all kinds. And, where you don't really have to touch the person. You can work on the person from a distance, because multiple reasons. You can actually put your fingers in their subtle body area. If you're working on the spine, like chiropractors, you can be working on chakras. There's a lot of, there's so many ways that the subtle bodies can work on alternative healing therapies. Acupuncture and acupressure. That's a subtle body phenomena. Here's actually a picture of showing the meridians with the subtle body. We don't understand how acupuncture work. We probably won't until we get into subtle body theory and understand the etheric body. Those meridians are part of the subtle bodies. The acupuncture points are the points at which the subtle body binds to the physical body. It doesn't bind at every point. So we can manipulate to a certain extent subtle bodies at those particular points, not at every point. So that's why those points have special need. But there are a lot of other connections too, and that's why the etheric body can't just disappear when you die. It hangs around. Healing through prayer, Larry Dossey does a great job on this. You know, bottom line, Larry Dossey has showed in these double-blind experiments, you know, if prayer were a medicine, it would be approved because it meets all the statistical criteria. And again, this is something you can't seal off. It's independent of distance. Morphogenesis is something that Rupert Sheldrake has really pushed. The idea here is that we could, a lot of people, I'd say most scientists just assume morphogenesis is the ability of a seed or a fertilized egg to you know, become a living form. They used to think that it was an animalcule that kind of just grew bigger and bigger and bigger. In fact, there even were scientists who swear they saw the little animalcule under a microscope. But as it turns out, that's not quite true. Morphogenesis is really it's very complicated system as to how a seed can become a plant, or a fertilized egg can become a living human being. And it's just kind of always been assumed that you know, most scientists will say, well, it's just, you know, biochemistry and genetics, and they leave it at that. But Rupert Sheldrake has really gone far to show that that's not a realistic approach. This is a much more complex system. But Rupert Sheldrake does great stuff, but everything he really says is covered by subtle body theory, though he doesn't mention subtle body theory. But it's all, everything he says, the psychic properties, the learning properties of an entire species of animal at a distance, is all really part of, again, subtle body. And that's an important phenomenon. Miracles, gee, today even your priests, the science is so strong in our thinking, even your priests don't believe that Jesus did any miracles. They were just kind of stories, metaphors of sorts, you know, but they did really happen. I mean, that's because, you know, scientists can't believe that these phenomena could possibly happen. But when you introduce subtle bodies, miracles are not by any means out of the question. I mean, it's something quite possible, and there's no question. Jesus, being the mystic that he was, one of the greatest mystics, I mean, was quite capable of manipulating, utilizing subtle bodies in that. Let's see. Out-of-body experiences, don't have to explain that to you. I mean, if you have a astral body, you can certainly leave your body under proper conditions and travel about. Near-death experiences, I've published one article on this, and I've also got a couple on the internet. The thing that intrigues me is a lot of people who have had near-death experiences have kind of contacted me, and they're a little surprised that I haven't, you know, talking about this the way I do. So, you know, I guess this really connects with them from the point of view of what things are like in the near-death experience. Reincarnation. Reincarnation is a little hard to do randomized, double-blind, placebo effect experiment on, unfortunately. I can't really prove. Every culture has stories about reincarnation, about people who were born and they know people from another village. They can name everybody in that village, and we find all kinds of weird justifications. Mostly it's nonsense. But if a child in this culture is brought up and he kind of remembers things from a previous life, by the time he's 5, I can assure you he will not. They won't let him. We won't let him, you know, because we just don't allow that type of thinking. Other cultures allow it. So it becomes a natural part of their thinking process. So, I mean, all of these things, when you put them together, there's a vast amount of evidence as to subtle body theory. Everything that I've shown you can be explained, and more. I mean, I could talk about astrology. You know, again, scientists say, well, astrology can't be true. I mean, there's no way electromagnetic waves from some distant planet can possibly affect you. And that's true, absolutely. But pranic waves could, you know, when they hit, touch your subtle body. So astrology can be explained, and traditionally has been. I mean, that's not something I came up with, but if you go to India, because they know about the pranic body, they know that the planets and constellations and their interaction are affecting you on the you know, pranic level, not on the visible body level. There are some Western things. I don't know if any of you have heard about cold fusion, which was popular 10 years ago. Pons and Fleischmann discovered this reaction, which interestingly enough, it was too strong a reaction to be chemical, so they said it was nuclear, but it didn't produce any radioactivity, so they called it cold fusion. But actually, the physicists didn't like that too much, and they're now in France because they really got trounced by this. But in all probability, what they got into is an interaction between visible matter and etheric matter, which, as I said, there has to be. And they just don't know it yet. So they're probably dealing with a totally new type of force, and that's going to be harder to explain than cold fusion, to be truthful, when they come out with it. But the Japanese are working on this. Another idea, the Gaia principle, I mean the Earth spirit principle. The Earth is regarded as having subtle bodies itself. So we can, on that level, interact with the entire planet. And the vegetation on it and everything else. We've already seen how plants can interact to our thoughts. Cleve Baxter actually did a lot of that work. There's a whole book out on the secret life of plants. You know, the phenomenon is great, but there's one other thing, if I have time, I want to run through. We do have a few minutes. I had to rush this a little, so I'm sorry if you didn't hear anything I said or understand it, but anyway. But the last point is, though, it's really good to know about subtle body theory and to see it as a model for not only for remote viewing, but a lot of other phenomena. But nevertheless, the real question is, how do you get in touch? How do you experience the subtle bodies? And I really think the remote viewing techniques are right in line with that. But you know, it occurred to me quite a while ago, actually. It's probably about almost 20 years ago. It occurred to me, you know, because I was teaching physics at the time, I said, you know, I wonder why logical thinking works in science the way it does. I mean, there's really no reason, except, you know, that's a natural mental connection. I thought, you know, there's another mental connection that's natural, and that's analogy, you know. I mean, we often think in terms of analogies. In fact, third world people think more analogical than they do logical. This is a more natural way of thinking, I discovered. My wife immediately bought me a book at the time, which I immediately put aside for 20 years. But lo and behold, you know, I finally pulled this book out, and I mean, I wish I'd have read it when she gave it to me. It was on Swedenborg, and Swedenborg is talking about the science of correspondence. And the science of correspondence, Swedenborg was like an 18th century scientist, a brilliant man. Also a religious man, and he created a few sciences on his own. And but at some point he discovered that the science didn't explain anything about religion, just like we have today. I mean, science has been so silent about religion that most scientists think there's nothing of value there because of it. But even back then, I mean, it was obviously quiet about it. So he actually started studying his dreams and started exploring, and they say he had some sort of meditative technique he used, but they don't know what it was. But he finally went through all this, and he actually has written books on having visited heaven and hell and talked with dead people, and there are verifiable records, and he's very psychic. I mean, he was able to see things, well, anyway, his story is kind of incredible. One of the things he points out is that there is a science, as he calls it, a science of science, which is the science of correspondence. And it is an analogical way of putting things together, but really metaphor is probably a better word because it's more tightly tied. Basically, in this way of thinking, relationships will become identity, and it can lead to a direct knowledge. This seems to be the superior way of connecting thoughts. Actually, is the law of correspondence. This is the traditional way mystics do, as I'll try and point out to you. It often appears, though, very simple and naive, and is bound to be ignored because of that. And I always think of the image of the scarab in ancient Egypt being which is a dung beetle, being connected with the sun somehow, and that strikes me as strange. But then you realize, they're desert people, and this beetle's pushing around this piece of dung, and dung for desert people is actually a source of fuel. It's very valuable. So, well, the sun is a source of fuel too. Well, that doesn't quite, of course, get you there. Actually, you really have to shift your consciousness to obviously see the relationship becoming identity. The way Joseph Campbell talks about it, if you ever see his lecture on the chakras, the first chakra, he says, is, kind of for survival, and the second one is for reproduction. The third one has to do with power and money. You get to the fourth chakra, that's where the spiritual things open up. And he says at that point, relationship becomes identity, and the self-luminous bodies become visible. So he's really talking, self-luminous bodies are the subtle bodies. And it's at that point where also when you can see those bodies that you'll see the identity between things that we would normally may be related, but we certainly don't see them as identical. There are a lot of examples of this. Of course, symbolism is utilized by mystics throughout the world. Now, those symbols that they use for different types of phenomena are actually correspondences, so that they can help you to get to what they symbolize when you to see the identity between the symbol and the object. But obviously, it takes a lot of training. This is a life's task. Oops, I'm pointing the wrong way. This is going to be great. Dreams, of course, contain tremendous symbolism. There's so much to be said about dreams. One thing that always strikes me is the traditional Western view of dreams is because the Western scientist only thinks that this is the only reality that there is. Compare that with mysticism, that thinks this is kind of Maya, and that there's or illusion, and there's a much higher reality. Everything is interpreted in terms of the present. So dreams are viewed as they have survival value because they help you sleep better, and that that's about all they say. I read a strange. It really brought the issue home about how science views dreams. These guys were studying the firing of neurons in a person while he's dreaming, and they discovered the firing was random, and their conclusion was Freud was wrong. That was their conclusion. And why did they conclude that? Because randomness has no information in it. So I imagine they were expecting Morse code or something. I don't know what they were expecting there. But that just shows you how you can really miss the point and value. Well, Freud did bring home the value of dreams in psychoanalysis, and so did Jung. About one of the nicest things you can do for yourself is probably to record your dreams. That's where Swedenborg began. There's a guy recently, Arnold Bendel, who's been able to show that illnesses and even aches and pains actually have correspondences to something much bigger in you, and that biggerness is often revealed in dreams. And he has a system called process therapy. He wrote a book called The Dream Body, which talks quite a bit about it. But through the process therapy, you can then connect your issue with the more deeper meaning of it, you might say, on a more subtle body issue. But he says that it really, the dream actually reveals it, and then you have to work through it. And so you need really a good guide, someone really like him. And I've read some of the stuff he's done. It's amazing. The book called The Dream Body, he says actually the dream body also is a subtle body, so he utilizes a similar idea here. Iconography, the paintings that we see are really correspondences to spiritual issues. That's why they use them so much in mysticism or in Tibet and other countries. Iconography is, of course, spiritual drawings, but don't get the idea. Thank you. Don't get the idea that iconography is kind of random drawings. Iconography is more like mechanical drawing. The proportions have to be just perfect. It's really, really strange. Don't go too far now. Mantras, just a sound, special sound can bring up a whole world of a whole other world. Mantras are used also quite frequently to, they correspond, that vibration corresponds to, again, something beyond our normal knowledge. It's a direct correspondence. Authentic ritual, oh boy. Ritual utilizes really all types of correspondence and puts them together. Ritual can be done in minutes or it can be weeks. One of the things about rituals have the ability to bring in really an essence or reenactment so that you can get in touch with an event that occurred which had usually high spiritual value, or it can bring a quality into a presence. That's about the only way you could say it. I mean, it's a very potent thing. Of course, in the world today, we don't know too much about ritual, actually. Most people would rather hear lectures than ritual. I mean, I'd rather partake of a ritual than hear some of the sermons I've heard lately. But one thing to point out, like in Christianity today, one of the central rituals is the sacrament of the Eucharist, which is utilized in transubstantiation. And if those of you are familiar with it, transubstantiation says that the bread and wine become the actual body, blood and body of Jesus Christ. This is not ever regarded as a symbolism, but is regarded as an identity. So again, this is one of the places where you still find an identity concept exists. In fact, if you look at the word transubstantiation, it seems to have had much broader meaning at some point. Today it's exclusively used that the wine and the bread are identical to the blood and the body of Christ. Obviously, this isn't true on a normal state of consciousness, but apparently at some level it can become true. My wife has been involved with what you call expressive arts, which is has the same qualities of ritual, where you utilize art to induce this quality or presence as well. And in fact, you don't have to know anything about art. It's an arting process, and probably the less you know, the better about art, because it's the process of the art that really enables that identity or that quality to be induced. And she's really worked with people who are undergone trauma. She's worked with people from Kosovo, and this technique seems to really work quite well. If you can imagine the depth of trauma people from Kosovo might be dealing with, I mean, to be able to reach that depth, you have to really go very deep. So what you see here is actually the typical science of correspondence is typically the things that most religions utilize to get to these deeper spaces. Mythology, Joseph Campbell does an excellent job. We no longer quite look at mythology as something as false stories, but actually as deeper truths. At least most of us do, not our mainstream scientists, I'm sure. But alchemy, Carl Jung, of course, has dwelled in all of these things from dreams down through alchemy. I mean, Carl Jung's been potent at this, but nevertheless, I still pick up textbooks and they say, well, the people used to believe that there were 4 or 5 elements and fire, water, and blah, 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 but now we know better. But what they don't realize is, if you can go back, Barb, to the mandala picture, what they don't realize, the previous one might be better, is that actually the 4 or 5 element theory, and I prefer the 5 element theory, which they use in Tibet, they also use in China, in Taoism. Those are correspondences. Those are not elements in the way we scientists think of elements. These are 4, you could say they're 5 major archetypes in the world. The idea here is to see those, the whole world as those, in terms of those 5 elements. This, by the way, penetrates all the subtle bodies, so it deals not only with our conscious world, our unconscious world, it's everything. And it's a technique that's been utilized throughout ages to see the world in terms of these 5 elements, not to judge the world, simply to understand the world as being composed of these 5 metaphors, 5 basic metaphors. And this leads people actually into an experience of what you call enlightenment, I guess, but they often refer to as leading into well, what we would call the Holy Trinity, which in Tibet they call the Trikaya doctrine. They have the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. Those are really equivalent to Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but they're talked about quite differently. So the five-element theory in alchemy, and of course alchemy deals with tons of other symbols, which Carl Jung just loved to talk about. I mean, these are really incredible symbols that are utilized, but you can obviously get caught up in the nonsense of it, which all too many people do, or trying to turn lead into gold, and they were doing it, trying to get rich doing it. Even back in Paracelsus' day, I mean, you could study both. Even in Newton's day, Newton was actually more of an alchemist than a scientist. He was astrologer and alchemist, and he did ever science. Nobody knows too. I mean, there are books of his that he really utilized a lot of alchemy. So, but like Ben Jonson wrote a book, The Alchemist, which is kind of the alchemist in that book is a charlatan. So there was always this idea of great knowledge and trickery or chicanery or whatever. Some more examples. The Kabbalah, go to the Kabbalah picture. This is becoming more popular these days because Madonna's gotten into it out in Hollywood, so this is big time stuff. This again, there consists, it's a pattern, and what you do is you learn the pattern and you learn the connections between the patterns. It's really a marvelous system, and it really can take a lifetime to learn. I mean, it's very tricky. There's a lot of good information out on it though these days. But there comes a point when you study this that after a while you don't need that pattern, just like with the five-element theory. At some point you don't really need that pattern, you just see things the way they are, and it becomes very automatic. Swedenborg actually believed that the hieroglyphics and possibly the entire Egyptian language was correspondence. So those hieroglyphics we use are actually correspondent images, or that the Egyptians used. Their language would have been too. They were very aware of correspondences, of course, and like I said, they knew all about subtle body theory. Everyone, would seem at the peak of ancient Egypt, everybody would have known about subtle body theory and subtle phenomena. Not everybody would have had the ability to utilize or manipulate them like the priests might have, but the knowledge was generally there. Astrology, again, is a correspondence. When you have someone do a chart, the way all those planets fit into the different signs of